The young stable boy whispered, "I know how to save your horse." And what happened next shattered the pride of the richest man in the valley. On a freezing Montana morning, when a fallen racehorse drew its last trembling breath, no one expected the quiet, wandering boy to step forward. But when he whispered, soft as snowfall, "I know how to save your horse," the entire valley stopped. Because sometimes the smallest voice carries the truth no one else dares to hear. Snow fell in slow, wandering flakes across the Whitlock Valley, drifting like pale ash from a winter sky that refused to brighten. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, the kind of cold Montana saved for the days when it wanted to remind people who truly owned the land. Near the training ring, fenced by weather-beaten rails, Silver Ghost stood trembling in the open, his breath rising in two thin plumes that broke apart in the wind. Once, the sight of him stepping onto this dirt had brought crowds to their feet. Once, his white coat had glistened beneath the stadium lights like moonlit water, and Grant Whitlock had walked beside him with the certainty of a man who believed legacy could be gripped like a trophy. But on this morning, Ghost's legs shook as though they no longer belonged to him. His head hung low. The proud arch of his neck collapsed into a weary curve. When he tried to take a step, his hind leg buckled, and the sound, a dull thud of a collapsing giant, echoed across the quiet ranch like a sentence being delivered. A few ranch hands froze. One of them swore under his breath. Another whispered that maybe it was time to call the vet again, though they all knew the vet had already said everything that needed saying. On the porch of the main house, Grant Whitlock watched with a stillness that felt like stone settling into place. He rested both hands on the railing, knuckles whitening, jaw clenched so tightly he looked as if he were biting back something bitter. The cold wind tugged at his coat, but he didn't move. For a man known across Montana horse circles, known for big deals, big money, and a bigger pride, stillness was unusual. Silence was worse. Grant had built this ranch, and the Whitlock name, on success stories and beautiful animals. Yet here stood his finest creation, the horse that had put Whitlock stables on billboards and sports marketing campaigns, unable even to lift his body from the bruising weight of winter. "Come on, boy," Grant muttered under his breath, almost a plea. "Stand up." Ghost didn't move. A couple of hands hurried forward, but the horse rolled his eyes in panic, nostrils flaring wide. He pushed his front legs into the snow, tried to rise, failed, and collapsed again with a low, defeated groan. One of the men stepped back, as though the sight punched the air from his lungs. "That's it," someone whispered. "He's done." The wind carried the words across the yard, but Grant didn't acknowledge them. He kept staring, as though willpower alone might knit Ghost back together. His breath came out shaky, frosting in the air between him and the truth he refused to accept. Losing a horse was one thing. Losing this horse, this legend, was an entirely different kind of wound. The sort a rancher hid behind money, authority, and a reputation strong enough to intimidate even the banks that partnered with him. A pickup door slammed somewhere. A hand shouted for help with the feed. Life on the ranch kept moving because it had no other choice. But the moment around Ghost felt suspended, as if the world were waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. Among the scattering of workers stood a boy the others barely noticed. 17. Slim. wrapped in a patched winter jacket too thin for the cold. Elias Cooper didn't step forward like the rest. He didn't recoil either. He simply watched Ghost with an expression too calm to be indifference and too sad to be fear. His eyes, quiet gray like the sky before snowfall, shifted over Ghost's trembling legs, the sharp knots of tension along his spine, the way his ears twitched not with pain alone, but with confusion. Elias had seen that look before, on animals pushed past their limits, animals carrying wounds no one bothered to see. Someone nudged him as they walked past. "Stay back, kid. Horse like that'll crush you if he panics." Elias gave a small nod, but didn't move from where he stood. The snow collected on his sleeves as he observed Ghost with a strange, almost reverent patience, the kind the valley hadn't seen in years. Ghost tried once more to rise. Once more, he fell. When he finally stopped fighting, the ranch seemed to exhale in resignation. It was Tom Briggs, the foreman, who broke the heavy quiet. "Mr. Whitlock," he called toward the porch, "we'll need to bring the sled. He can't stay in the open like this." Grant didn't answer. He stepped off the porch, boots sinking into the snow, and approached the fallen horse with the stride of a man walking toward the remains of a dream. His breath came out hard, forming clouds that vanished before they reached the ground. When he reached Ghost, he crouched beside him and placed a gloved hand on the horse's neck. "Come on," he said in a low, stern voice. "Don't do this to me. Not you." Ghost shivered at the sound, but didn't try to stand. Grant closed his eyes. Only for a second. Only long enough for anyone watching closely to wonder if the cold had finally cracked something inside him. One ranch hand stepped forward, rope in hand. "Sir, should we—" "Back off," Grant snapped, sharper than the wind. "He's not dead." His voice carried authority, but not conviction. The men stepped back, murmuring quietly. A couple whispered about insurance, another mentioned vet bills. One of them, trying to lighten the mood, joked about horse rehab programs, a clever nod to digital marketing humor, about premium insurance services and high CPC keywords like equine injury treatment, veterinary recovery solutions, animal health care support. The joke fell flat. Ghost lay still. And then, as Grant straightened, frustrated and helpless, a soft crunch of snow sounded behind him. Elias stepped forward. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if trying not to disturb the cold air around them. He didn't speak to the ranch hands. He didn't look at Grant. He only knelt beside Ghost and let his hand hover a few inches above the trembling ribs, as though asking permission from a creature too tired to answer. Grant frowned. "What do you think you're doing?" Elias didn't look up. He swallowed once, the way someone swallows when gathering courage. His voice came out quiet, steady, and strange for a boy who'd spent most of his life unseen. "Mr. Whitlock," he said softly, "I know how to save your horse." Every sound in the yard stilled. Even the wind felt like it paused. Grant stared at him, disbelief tightening every line of his face. The ranch hands exchanged glances, some amused, some pitying, some annoyed. But Elias didn't blink. He kept his gaze on Ghost, like he was speaking to both man and animal in the same breath. Ghost turned his head, slowly, painfully, and looked at Elias as if the boy's quiet tone reached a place no command ever had. The moment stretched long enough for something faint, fragile, and almost impossible to name to flicker in the cold. Grant finally spoke. "You've got 5 seconds," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Explain yourself." The boy lifted his eyes, and before Grant could bark another accusation, Elias whispered, "Ghost isn't giving up. He's asking for help you haven't known how to give." The words hung there, soft yet heavier than the winter sky, pulling the story, and Grant Whitlock himself, into a direction no one on that ranch expected. And as the last of the morning light sank into the snow, the wind shifted, carrying a feeling that the ground beneath the Whitlock ranch had quietly begun to change. The yard fell silent after Elias spoke, the kind of silence that made even the snowflakes seem hesitant to land. Grant Whitlock stared at the boy, as if trying to measure the distance between arrogance and sincerity. The ranch hands waited too, though none of them expected anything except another outburst from the man who had spent his whole life bending horses and people into obedience. But instead of shouting, Grant narrowed his eyes and stepped closer, the crunch of snow beneath his boots sounding like small fractures in the morning stillness. "You're saying you can fix what experts can't?" he asked, voice sharp enough to cut through the cold. Elias didn't flinch. He kept one hand hovering above Ghost's rib cage, close enough for the horse to feel his warmth. "I'm saying he's not broken the way you think," the boy replied quietly. "You're treating the wrong wound." Ghost breathed out a cloud of frost that drifted past Elias's sleeve. The young man watched the breath fade, his gaze soft with the kind of patience Grant hadn't seen in a long time, certainly not in a boy who swept barns for minimum wage and slept in the old tack room because he had nowhere else to go. Grant frowned, as if he didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't intimidated by his voice. "Fine," Grant said finally. "You want to try? Then earn it." He turned away, snow brushing from his coat like dust from stone. "A week, that's all you get. If that horse isn't standing on his own by the rodeo, you're gone. No arguments, no second chances." Around them, the ranch hands exchanged looks, some smirks, some pity. No one bothered trying to hide the assumption that Elias had just signed his own goodbye letter. But the boy didn't react. He simply nodded, as though this deadline wasn't a threat, but a truth he had been expecting. Tom Briggs approached him slowly, boots creaking under the frost. Tom carried the tired posture of a man who'd seen too many promises go nowhere. "Kid," he muttered, "you don't have to impress him. There's no saving Ghost. This kind of injury, it's the end of the trail." Elias finally stood, brushing the snow from his knees. "It's the end," he said gently, "when someone decides it is." He paused, watching Ghost's labored breathing. But Ghost hasn't decided that yet. Tom studied him, lines deepening around his eyes. "You sound like your grandmother. Heard she was some sort of healer." A flicker passed through Elias's gaze. Surprise, memory, grief, all layered so quietly it nearly disappeared. "She listened," he answered simply. "Most people don't." While the hands prepared a sled to bring Ghost into the barn, Elias walked beside the horse, not guiding him, not forcing him, only staying close enough for Ghost to sense a presence that wasn't demanding anything. When Ghost stumbled, Elias didn't reach out. He simply slowed his steps. The ranch hands muttered that the boy was strange, too gentle to survive in a place built on hard work and harder men. But Ghost lifted his head just a little and followed. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and warm cedar wrapped around them. Lanterns cast amber light across the rafters, turning drifting dust into tiny planets. Ghost sank into a pile of straw, exhausted, sides heaving. The barn door thudded shut, and the world outside dimmed to a distant whisper. Elias knelt again, this time not to touch, but to let the horse adjust to the quiet. He breathed slowly, letting the rhythm settle the space between them. His voice, when it came, was barely above the creak of wood. "I'm not here to hurt you." Ghost twitched an ear toward him, a small gesture, but one that made Elias close his eyes with relief. Tom leaned against a beam nearby, watching. "You really think he understands?" Elias opened his eyes. "They always understand. They just stop believing people mean what they say." He paused. "Animals learn disappointment faster than we do." Tom looked away, jaw tightening at something the boy couldn't see. As Elias stood, he noticed Grant watching from the shadowed aisle, arms folded, expression unreadable. The rancher didn't say a word. He only nodded once, a gesture that felt less like permission and more like a warning. When Grant's footsteps faded, Elias returned to Ghost's side. He whispered softly, almost a vow to the dim barn and the breath of a fallen legend. "I'll be here in the morning." Ghost exhaled, a long, low sigh that drifted into the rafters like smoke from a tired fire. Before leaving the stall, Elias set down his old canvas bag, the one carrying his grandmother's notebook, herbs, and salves, and glanced back at the horse. "We'll take one step, just one, and that will be enough to start." Snow tapped gently against the barn windows. The ranch fell quiet around them. And in that quiet, something like the first fragile thread of trust knit itself between a boy no one saw and a horse no one believed in. By the next morning, the snow had settled into a quiet blanket over Whitlock Ranch, soft enough to muffle footsteps, but not the tension that rippled through the barns. Word of Elias's claim, his quiet promise to save Silver Ghost, had spread faster than the cold wind crawling over the hills. Ranch hands whispered about it over steaming mugs of coffee. Some laughed, some scoffed, and a few shook their heads with the pity reserved for someone too young to know when to give up. Yet all of them kept glancing at the old barn where Ghost lay, as though something might already be changing in the stillness inside. Grant Whitlock arrived before sunrise, boots dusted in frost, breath clouding in front of him like the exhaust of an overworked engine. He didn't speak to anyone. His eyes stayed fixed on the barn, on the old wooden door that creaked when he pulled it open. Inside, he found Elias kneeling beside Ghost, whispering something too soft for anyone else to hear. The scene made Grant pause, not because of the boy, but because Ghost's ears were turned toward Elias, as if the horse were listening, actually listening, in a way he hadn't responded to any voice in months. Grant stepped forward, boots thudding against the wooden floor. "You've had one night," he said, his voice low but edged with impatience. "One night doesn't heal a champion." Elias didn't look up. He rested his palm near Ghost's shoulder, close enough for warmth to travel between them, but not close enough to trap. "Healing starts with wanting to stay," he murmured. "He hasn't left us yet." Grant hated how those words unsettled him. He stalked closer, stopping beside the stall. "Understanding animals doesn't mean you can fix what's broken. Don't confuse compassion with skill." "I'm not confusing anything," Elias replied softly. "But you might be." The ranch hands nearby froze, stunned that a boy with no pedigree, no family name, no authority, would speak to Grant Whitlock with such calm honesty. Grant's brows drew down, the muscles in his jaw tightening into stone. "You're walking a thin line," he warned. Elias finally lifted his gaze. "I'm walking beside him," he said, nodding toward Ghost. "Not above him." The words struck deeper than they should have. Grant opened his mouth, whether to argue or to order Elias out, even he didn't seem sure, but stopped when Ghost shifted. Slowly, painfully, the horse turned his head toward Elias, his breath warming the boy's sleeve. The barn went silent, as if even the dust floating in those lantern-lit beams wanted witness to the moment. Tom Briggs entered then, carrying a bucket of warm mash. "Morning," he muttered, clearing his throat as he approached the stall. But when he saw Ghost's posture, he froze, eyebrows lifting with something like mild disbelief. "Well now, I haven't seen him pay attention like that since—" He didn't finish the sentence. Elias reached into his canvas bag, taking out a folded cloth infused with a faint herbal scent. Grant watched with suspicion. "What is that?" "A poultice," Elias answered. "My grandmother made them for injured horses in the Bitterroot Valley. Helps reduce inflammation. Easy to make, even easier to misuse." Grant bristled. "Are you implying misuse happened here?" Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth hung in the air like the smell of antiseptic, subtle but impossible to ignore. Tom shifted uncomfortably, pretending to busy himself with the feed bucket. Elias knelt again, his movements slow enough for Ghost to anticipate every touch. "Easy," he whispered. "No pressure today. Just warmth." When Ghost didn't flinch, Elias pressed the poultice gently along the injury site. The horse exhaled, the breath long and shaky. For a moment, even Grant felt the room breathe with him. "You're not afraid of him," Grant muttered, almost to himself. Elias shook his head. "Fear doesn't help him. Quiet does." Grant opened his mouth, the retort forming, sharp, ready to slice. But he never released it. Instead, he turned sharply away, coat brushing the stall door. "You have until the rodeo," he repeated, though the conviction in his tone wavered. 7 days. If he's not standing on his own by then, you're off my land." Elias didn't flinch at the deadline. He didn't even look up. He simply whispered, "Thank you, sir," in a way that made it sound like the boy had been waiting his whole life for someone to give him a chance, even if the chance was half threat, half condemnation. Grant hesitated just long enough for Tom to notice. The foreman watched his boss from the corner of his eye, then glanced at Elias again, with an expression caught somewhere between concern and cautious hope. "You sure about this, kid?" Tom asked when Grant left the barn. Elias nodded. "I don't need a week to make him run. I just need a week to help him trust that standing up is worth trying again." Those words, quiet as they were, sent a ripple through the barn deeper than the winter cold. Something had shifted. Just a fraction, just a breath, but enough that even Ghost seemed aware of it. The horse blinked slowly, leaning ever so slightly toward Elias's steady hands. As the boy prepared the stall for the long day ahead, Tom placed a hand on the wooden rail. "You know," he said, "Whitlock doesn't give second chances. Never has." Elias folded his cloths neatly, then met Tom's eyes. Then maybe this is the first time he'll see one given back to him. Snow drifted past the windows, catching the morning light like falling shards of glass. The barn felt warmer somehow, not from the lanterns, but from the fragile thread of hope stretching quietly between a fallen champion and the boy who believed in him, and as Elias stood to face the day's work, Ghost lifted his head a little higher, as though ready, just barely, to follow the voice that had spoken for him when no one else dared. By the third morning, frost clung to the windows of the old barn like a thin veil, blurring the world outside into soft shapes and muted colors. Inside, the air was warmer, tinged with the scent of hay and the slow burn of lantern light. Elias arrived before anyone else, his breath forming pale clouds as he crossed the aisle. He carried no rope, no whip, no tools of control, only his canvas bag and the quiet determination that had followed him since childhood, the kind that lived in people who had learned to survive by listening instead of demanding. Ghost lifted his head at the sound of footsteps. Not an alarm, just acknowledgement. A small thing, barely noticeable unless one was looking closely, but enough to stir something steady in Elias's chest. He stepped into the stall and paused, letting the silence stretch between them like a bridge being built plank by plank. "You're up early," Elias whispered, though he knew Ghost didn't need words. "So am I." The horse blinked slowly, his breath warm against the cold morning air. Elias lowered himself to the straw-covered floor with unhurried ease, knees drawn up, hands resting loosely on his lap. He didn't reach out, didn't push, didn't claim space that wasn't offered. Instead, he matched his breathing to Ghost's. Deep inhale, long exhale, until the tension in the horse's shoulders eased into something almost restful. The barn door creaked open behind them. Tom Briggs stepped in, carrying a bucket of warm water. "Kid," he murmured, voice soft so as not to break the fragile stillness. "You sure this is doing anything?" Elias nodded without thought, looking away from Ghost. "Trust is a slow language," he said, "but he's speaking." Tom frowned, though a small part of him wondered if the boy might be right. He placed the water down and leaned against the rail, watching the strange communion between them. Outside, the sun tried to push its way through the clouds, casting a muted glow across the rafters. Elias opened his canvas bag and retrieved a folded square of linen. He dipped it into the warm water, wrung it out gently, and held it toward Ghost. Not touching, just offering. The horse's nostrils flared, and he shifted his weight, muscles tightening in hesitation. Elias kept his arms steady, patient as still water. "Easy," he whispered. "No rush. Just see." Slowly, so slowly it felt like time itself leaned in to watch. Ghost lowered his head and brushed his muzzle against the warm cloth. Elias exhaled, a soft release of relief and gratitude. He moved closer, inch by inch, giving the horse every chance to refuse. But Ghost didn't retreat. He allowed Elias to touch his neck with the cloth, the warmth seeping into stiff muscles, loosening what pain had gripped for too long. Tom let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Well, I'll be—" Elias smiled faintly. He remembers gentleness. For the next hour, Elias worked in quiet rhythm, warming the cloth again and again, wiping away dried sweat and old dirt, tending to Ghost as though the horse were something fragile and sacred. His movements were steady, respectful, nothing like the hurried hands Ghost had grown used to, the firm grips, the masked frustration of men treating him like a broken tool rather than a living being. At one point, Ghost shifted and let his head rest near Elias's shoulder, a gesture full of exhaustion, but also trust. Elias froze, awed by the weight of the moment. He placed his hand lightly on the horse's cheek, feeling the warmth, the tremor, the vulnerable acceptance. "You're safe," he whispered. The door opened again, harsher this time, letting in a gust of cold air. Grant Whitlock strode in, sharp-eyed, boots echoing loudly against the wooden floor. Ghost jerked at the sound, muscles bracing in fear, but Elias steadied him with a soft murmur and the warmth of his hand. Grant stopped short at the sight before him, his prized stallion leaning into the boy's touch, calm in a way he hadn't been for months. For a fleeting second, something uncertain flickered across the rancher's face. "What are you doing to him?" Grant demanded, though his voice held less heat than usual. "Listening," Elias answered simply. Grant scoffed, yet the scene pressed on him in ways he couldn't ignore. Ghost's breathing had steadied. His eyes no longer darted around the stall in panic. There was peace. A thin, new thing, but unmistakable. "You don't fix a horse with breathing exercises," Grant muttered. "No," Elias agreed, "but you start with them." Grant opened his mouth to argue, but something silenced him. A memory, maybe, or simply the truth staring back at him from a pair of tired, trusting eyes. Tom stepped forward. "Sir, look at him. He hasn't let anyone get that close in weeks." Grant didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the poultice cooling in a small bowl nearby, then to the way Ghost's muscles relaxed under Elias's gentle strokes. The rancher's shoulders tightened, as though he were wrestling with something invisible but heavy. Finally, he said, "Don't get carried away. One good morning doesn't mean anything." Elias didn't challenge him. He simply kept working, steady, calm, grounded in patience the way his grandmother had taught him. Trust, she used to say, was the most valuable form of insurance, something money couldn't buy, something people in power often forgot how to earn. As Grant turned to leave, Elias whispered again to Ghost, voice soft enough to melt the barn's cold edges. "Tomorrow, we'll take one step. Just one, if you want to." Ghost lowered his head, his breath brushing against Elias's wrist as though marking the promise. Grant paused at the door. He didn't turn around, but the slight tremble in his exhale betrayed something Elias couldn't yet name. Something shifting. Something beginning. The barn quieted again, holding the faint warmth of the fragile trust forming between boy and horse, a trust that would soon be tested in ways none of them saw coming. A pale sun crept over the ridge the next morning, melting the edges of frost along the barn roof and dripping steady beads of water onto the cold ground. Elias had barely slept, not out of fear of failure, but because something unspoken had tugged at him all night, a quiet unease that settled behind his ribs like a knot waiting to be undone. When he approached Ghost's stall, the horse lifted his head with a soft grunt, not startled this time, simply weary, as though he recognized the footsteps of someone who wouldn't ask him for more than he could give. "Morning," Elias whispered, running his hand along the air beside Ghost's cheek, before letting it settle gently against the warm skin. Ghost leaned slightly into the touch. Not a dramatic gesture, not a triumph, just the simple, fragile permission of a creature learning to trust again. Elias worked slowly, checking the horse's breathing, the tightness in the hind leg, the heat radiating beneath the injured tissue. He unfolded a clean cloth, dipped it into warm water, and began wiping away remnants of yesterday's poultice. But as the cloth slid across Ghost's skin, Elias felt something foreign beneath the layers, something firmer, small, and unnatural. A stitched puncture. Not one. Several. He froze. He pressed gently with his fingers, tracing the faint marks arranged in a line that did not belong to any injury Ghost had sustained naturally. These were symmetrical, deliberate, the kind a vet might make. but only under certain conditions. Only for certain drugs. Elias's breath clouded in the cold air as he whispered, "What did they do to you?" He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. His mind raced back to his grandmother's notes, the warnings she wrote in the margins about overused stimulants, how they pushed horses beyond safety, how they masked pain until something tore. Her handwriting seemed to echo through him. When you numb a wound you cannot see, you make it grow deeper. A soft creak of floorboards broke the silence. Tom Briggs stepped inside, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Kid, you're in here earlier every day. Son's barely thinking about getting up." Elias didn't move his hand from the injury. "Tom," he said quietly, "these marks, someone injected him. Not just for pain. These are steroid entry points." Tom's face drained. He stepped closer, bending stiffly to examine the marks. His shoulders sank. "I hoped you wouldn't notice," Tom muttered. Elias's voice tightened, not angry, just hurting. "So it's true." Tom leaned his back against the stall door, looking older than he had the night before. "The trainers, before the last race, they didn't tell Whitlock everything. Maybe they thought they were helping him keep his champion. Maybe they wanted the bonus. Maybe they just didn't care who paid the price." Elias swallowed, the knot inside him growing heavier. He ran on a torn tendon because he couldn't feel it. "Yeah." Tom rubbed a hand over his face. "And it ruined him." They stood in silence as Ghost shifted, lifting his head as if sensing the thick sadness filling the barn. Elias brushed the horse's neck slowly. "He didn't fail," he whispered. "They pushed him until he broke." "Kid," Tom said, hesitant, "you can't tell Grant. Not yet. He'll go after the men responsible, and it'll tear this place apart. He already lost enough sleep over Ghost. You don't know the kind of fury he carries." Elias understood. Anger was a wildfire, and Grant Whitlock was a man full of dry timber. But Elias also knew truth didn't disappear just because someone buried it deep. It lived, pulsed, waited, like a bruise under skin. "I don't want revenge," Elias murmured. "I want him to know Ghost wasn't weak. He trusted people he shouldn't have." Tom's expression softened, marked with regret he didn't try to hide. "We all did." For a moment the barn settled into a thick quiet, the kind that felt almost like confession. Elias reached into his bag for a stronger herbal mixture, something his grandmother crafted for damaged nerves. Gentle, warming, restorative. He ground the herbs with slow, steady motions, letting the rich, earthy scent fill the air. Ghost watched him, blinking with a kind of exhausted patience. "Try not to blame yourself," Tom said quietly. "Ghost survived this long because he's got heart, and now, maybe he's got someone willing to fight for him." Elias didn't answer, but his hands worked with renewed focus. He applied the mixture over the injury, massaging it carefully, speaking in soft breaths that Ghost leaned into, as if understanding every syllable. "He needs time," Elias said. "Time, quiet, and someone who doesn't want anything from him." Tom nodded. "You got both, at least for now." But that, for now, lingered heavy, as if telling the truth, any truth, would test the thin thread holding the ranch together. Later that afternoon, when the barn door swung open again, Elias stiffened instinctively. Grant Whitlock stepped inside, blazer still on from a meeting in town, dust clinging to his boots. His gaze swept over the stall, over Tom, then settled on Elias and Ghost, with a weight that seemed to anchor the air. "How is he?" Grant asked. Elias hesitated, the truth burning behind his teeth. Ghost shifted painfully. Elias placed a steadying hand against the horse's shoulder. "He's trying," Elias said finally. "That's all he can give right now." Grant approached slowly. Ghost's muscles tensed, but Elias whispered something under his breath, and the tension eased. Grant noticed. He always noticed. "You think he can make the rodeo walk?" Grant asked quietly. "I think," Elias answered, "he deserves a chance to try." Grant exhaled, long and weary. "Then we do it on Saturday." The words settled like snow on dry branches, soft but heavy enough to bend them. Elias bowed his head. "Saturday." Tom stared at Grant, uncertainty flickering in his eyes, but said nothing. And Grant, who never lingered long in moments like these, hesitated at the stall door, watching the boy and the horse as if they were speaking a language he'd forgotten long ago. Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping across the valley with a low moan. Inside the barn, Elias whispered into the quiet, "They hurt you without listening. I won't make that mistake." Ghost pressed his muzzle gently into Elias's open palm. It was not forgiveness, but it was trust. New, fragile, and painfully honest. The morning of the rodeo arrived, with a gray sky stretched thin over Whitlock Valley, as if the clouds themselves were holding their breath. The cold had softened, but a restless wind rippled across the open fields, carrying the distant sound of trucks, laughter, and the metallic clatter of preparations in town. Elias walked beside Ghost, one hand hovering near the horse's neck. Not touching. Just offering presence, a reminder that he wasn't alone. Ghost limped slightly, but the tremor in his steps had eased. The herbal treatment had soothed the swollen tendon, though far from healed. Still, there was something different in his gait. A willingness. Faint, yet unmistakable. When Elias reached the barn door, he paused. The world outside was louder today. Ranch hands shouting directions, trailers backing up, a set, generator thrumming behind the sheds. Ghost's ears flicked nervously. Elias whispered, "Just look at me when you need to. The world can wait." Ghost exhaled slowly, leaning in just enough to steady himself. Inside the tack room, Tom Briggs adjusted his jacket, glancing out at the growing commotion. "Big turnout this year," he muttered. "Guess folks want to see if Whitlock's miracle horse still breathes." His tone wasn't unkind, just threaded with the worn cynicism of someone who had lived long enough to know how quickly crowds turn. Elias tightened the strap on Ghost's soft halter, choosing the gentlest one he could find. "He doesn't need them to believe in him," Elias said. "Just needs one moment without fear." Tom studied the boy for a long beat. "Kid, you've got more faith in things than most men twice your age." "I don't have more faith," Elias answered softly. "I just listen longer." Outside, the ranch hummed louder. Grant Whitlock's truck pulled up near the entry gate. He stepped out in a dark coat, face unreadable, jaw set like stone. He scanned the yard, eyes finding Elias and Ghost. For a fleeting second, Elias thought he saw something like worry flicker across Grant's features, quickly buried beneath a rancher's pride. "You ready?" Grant asked Ghost more than the boy. Ghost shifted uneasily. Elias answered for him. "He'll try." Grant's gaze snapped to him. There was no anger today, just a hollow weight, as if something inside the man feared the answer more than the failure. "Trying won't be enough if he stumbles," he said. "People are expecting a show." Elias frowned. keeping his voice calm. "This isn't a show for him. It's survival." Grant didn't respond. He turned and walked toward the truck, shoulders taut beneath the heavy coat. The drive to town was quiet. Elias rode in the back of the trailer with Ghost, keeping a hand close enough to reassure the horse whenever he flinched. The road wound through the valley, passing frozen fences, barren cottonwoods, and the faint outline of the rodeo grounds rising like a rusted crown in the distance. When they arrived, the noise hit Ghost like a wave. Music, voices, boots, the crackle of loudspeakers, the metallic clank of gates being locked. He trembled. Elias placed a steady hand near his shoulder. "Look at me," he whispered. Ghost turned his head slightly, and the trembling eased. Tom opened the side door, peering in. "Crowd's bigger than usual. Guess folks came to see if Whitlock's throwing in the towel or planning a resurrection." Elias nodded once. "Then let's give them honesty. Just honesty." Grant appeared moments later, posture stiff. He stood at the trailer's edge, watching Elias back Ghost down the ramp. The horse hesitated, hooves scraping against the metal, breath quickening. The smell of kettle corn, fresh manure, and cold metal mixed in the air. Too many memories for a horse who had fallen from glory. Elias whispered, "One step at a time." Ghost responded, shifting backward with trembling caution until his hooves touched dirt. They led him into the holding pen. People gathered fast, murmuring. Elias heard someone say, "That poor thing shouldn't be here." Another whispered, "Is Whitlock desperate or stupid?" Someone laughed, Ghost's ears flattened. Grant stepped forward. "Keep him steady," he ordered, though his voice wasn't cruel, just desperate. Elias obeyed, placing himself between Ghost and the swelling noise. The announcer crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a special appearance today from Silver Ghost, Whitlock's legendary racer." Cheers followed, mixed with a few doubtful groans. Ghost shifted, unsettled. Elias rested his palm just above the horse's heart, breathing with him, letting the rhythm soften. Then came the signal. A rodeo hand opened the gate. "Bring him to the center." Elias led Ghost forward, but not by pulling the rope. He walked beside him, pace slow, matching each hesitant step. The ground was uneven from boot prints. Ghost's injured leg trembled. The crowd quieted, sensing the gravity of the moment. The fall of a legend. The boy who dared to stand beside him, and the rancher whose pride hung in the balance. At the halfway point, Ghost stopped abruptly, muscles locking with a jolt that nearly toppled him. His chest heaved, breath sharp, eyes wide with memory and fear. Elias stepped in front of him, blocking the view of the crowd, speaking softly so only Ghost could hear. "You're not back there," Elias murmured. "You're here. With me." Ghost's breathing slowed. He blinked. Then, like a strike of bad luck, someone in the back dropped a metal feed pan. The crash echoed through the arena. Ghost reared, hooves striking the air. The crowd gasped. Elias didn't move. He didn't dive away or flinch. Instead, he reached up, both hands open, and whispered, "I'm here. I'm here. Look at me, not them." Ghost landed hard, but his eyes found Elias, shaking, confused but anchored. Tom shouted from the fence, "Give him a second, kid!" Grant stood frozen, jaw clenched, fingers gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. Elias took a slow breath. "It's your choice," he said softly to Ghost. "One step. That's all." The arena held its breath. Ghost lowered his head. He stepped forward. One step. Then another. The whispers around the arena faded into a stunned hush. The boy and the horse moved as one fragile, stubborn heartbeat in the middle of the cold winter rodeo. When they reached the circle's end, Elias stopped, letting Ghost rest. He placed a hand on the horse's cheek. "That's enough," he whispered. "More than enough." Grant exhaled sharply, half disbelief, half relief. For the first time in years, the rancher looked less like a man built of iron and more like someone remembering how to feel. Ghost nudged Elias's shoulder gently. The crowd did not cheer. They simply watched with a quiet reverence, witness to a moment not of triumph, but of survival. And sometimes, survival was the bravest thing a living thing could do. As Elias led Ghost back toward the gate, Grant stepped into their path. His voice was rough, but not unkind. "Whatever you did, it wasn't luck." Elias met his gaze. "No, sir. He just needed someone to listen." Grant didn't reply, but something in his face shifted, only slightly, like a man beginning to see a truth that had been in front of him all along. The rodeo grounds didn't settle after Ghost's trembling steps. If anything, the air thickened, crowds pressing closer to the rails, whispers turning sharp, waiting for either a miracle or a collapse. Elias could feel it pulsing through the dirt beneath his boots, through the cold air that tasted like metal and dust. Ghost stood beside him, sides heaving, the strain of the short walk clear in the quiver of his hind leg. Elias rested his fingers near the horse's jaw, grounding him with steady breath. But the world didn't stay quiet. It rarely did. A group of ranchers near the far fence laughed harshly, loud enough for their words to carry. "Whitlock's finally cracked," one shouted, "bringing a cripple to parade around like a trophy." Another added, "Kid's just delaying the inevitable. Should have put that horse down months ago." A third voice chimed in, mocking, "Maybe he wants the sympathy vote." Elias didn't turn. Ghost didn't need him to react. He needed him to stay still. But the voices lodged in the horse's memory like burrs under the skin. Ghost shifted with a jerky movement, neck twitching as he flicked his ears toward the clamor. His muscles tightened, his breathing sharpened. "Easy," Elias murmured. "They don't know you." Before Ghost could settle, a rodeo hand hurried past the pen, dragging a metal bucket that clattered against the ground. The impact rang through the arena like a gunshot. Ghost lurched violently, rearing halfway before his injured leg buckled beneath him. Spectators gasped. Dust swirled. Elias didn't think. He moved. He stepped directly into Ghost's line of panic, both hands up, palms open, not touching, offering. Ghost's hooves came down dangerously close, slicing the dirt inches from Elias's boots. The boy's heart hammered against his ribs, but he didn't step back. He kept his breathing steady, soft, his voice gentler than the wind pushing across the open sky. "It's me, Ghost," he whispered. "Look at me. I'm right here." Something in the tone, not the words, cut through the storm inside the horse. Ghost's wild eyes flicked toward Elias, searching for a threat that wasn't there. Elias lowered his hands slowly, not forcing, just inviting Ghost to follow the rhythm of his breath. Around them, the arena had gone, silent. Even the children clinging to the rails seemed to hold still. Tom Briggs watched with his jaw clenched, a kind of terrified respect, tightening the lines on his face. Grant Whitlock stood like a statue, fists curled so hard his gloves creaked. Ghost trembled, nostrils flaring in uneven bursts, but his gaze stayed on the boy. "That's it," Elias murmured. "Just us. Just breathe." He moved closer, inch by inch, the way he had in the barn. Patient, steady, letting Ghost choose the pace. The horse's head lowered a fraction. It wasn't calm, not yet, but it was surrendering to something gentler than fear. The wild edge softened, replaced with a wounded uncertainty Elias recognized painfully well. He reached up and placed his palm against Ghost's forehead. Ghost shuddered, then stilled. The crowd exhaled, a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Tom whispered under his breath, "Kid, you're out of your damn mind." But there was awe in it, and gratitude. Grant stepped closer to the railing. His voice, when it came, was low, rough. "Get him out of the ring," he said, "before someone gets hurt." Elias didn't look at him. "He's already hurt," he answered softly. "I'm helping him remember he isn't alone." Grant's expression flickered. Annoyance, confusion, maybe even shame, but he didn't argue. Ghost finally released a long, shaky breath and lowered his head until it nearly touched Elias's chest. The boy let it rest there, one hand curled lightly against the thick white mane, the other steady near Ghost's cheek. Not controlling, just anchoring. Elias turned slightly so the horse wouldn't see the faces pressed too close against the rails. "Come with me," he whispered, and stepped sideways. Ghost hesitated. His injured leg trembled, but he shifted his weight and followed. Small, uncertain, but willing. They moved together until they reached the edge of the arena, where the noise thinned and the winter air felt less suffocating. Elias paused and pressed his forehead briefly against Ghost's, a silent thank you for trust given in the rawest moment. When he finally stepped back, the crowd broke into soft applause, not the celebratory kind, but a gentle, reverent sound that felt like respect. A few people wiped their eyes. A child asked her father why the boy didn't use a whip. The father didn't have an answer. Tom approached cautiously. "You okay, kid?" Elias nodded. He just needed someone not to run. Ghost nudged Elias's shoulder, a quiet gesture, almost apologetic. Elias smiled and rubbed the horse's neck. "We're all scared of something," he whispered. "It's what we do when fear shows up that matters." From the fence line, Grant watched the pair with an expression Elias couldn't read. Not anger, not pride, something heavier, something breaking, something rebuilding. Without a word, the rancher turned and walked away. Slow steps, shoulders stiff, as though carrying a weight he had ignored for years. Elias let Ghost rest, staying by his side until the trembling passed. Around them, the rodeo resumed. Announcements crackling, bulls snorting in their pens, cowboys tightening ropes. But none of it reached the small island of quiet between boy and horse. And as the winter sun dipped low behind the mountains, Ghost nudged Elias again. Not from fear this time, but from recognition. A fragile understanding had rooted itself in that arena, deeper than the crowd could see. Elias touched the horse's muzzle gently. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "We'll try again." Ghost answered with a soft exhale, warm against the boy's hand. Together they walked out of the arena, not victorious, not defeated, just two souls choosing each other in a world that had forgotten how to slow down and listen. The hours after Ghost's near panic drifted by with the strange quiet that follows a storm. Not relief, not calm, but a trembling balance where everything feels one breath away from breaking again. The rodeo grounds had thinned. The loudest events were finished, leaving only the hum of generators, the smell of dust and kettle corn, and the rustling of people gathered near the rails as if unwilling to leave before they understood what they had witnessed. Elias stood with Ghost at the far end of the arena, where the noise softened into a low murmur. The winter light had turned golden, stretching long shadows across the churned-up dirt. Ghost's sides rose and fell slowly now, each breath less jagged than before. Elias stroked the warm place beneath his jaw, letting his hand rest there long enough for the horse to feel the truth in the steadiness. "You did enough," Elias whispered. "More than anyone asked for." Ghost nudged his palm, not in fear this time, but with the tentative beginnings of trust. Trust shaped from pain, stitched together in silence, fragile but undeniably real. Tom Briggs crossed the arena toward them, his boots leaving deep prints in the dirt. "Kid," he said softly, "I've worked ranches 40 years, never seen a horse come down from a panic like that. Not like this." Elias shook his head. He calmed himself. "I only stood there with him." Tom exhaled. "Sometimes that's all any of us need." Before Elias could respond, a voice crackled through the speakers. The announcer spoke with the slow drawl of a man who'd lost his script, but found something else. Curiosity, maybe even respect. "Folks, we're bringing Silver Ghost back to the center for one final walk." The crowd stirred, excitement rippling through the stands. Grant Whitlock appeared by the gate, shoulders squared, expression carved from stone. He didn't look at Elias at first, only at Ghost, and at the long stretch of arena dirt ahead of them. "He can stop any time," Elias said quietly, anticipating Grant's unspoken command. "This isn't about proving anything." Grant glanced at him sharply. "It is to them." Elias met his gaze. "Then let them learn something better." For several long seconds, Grant didn't speak again. Then he stepped back from the gate, leaving the space open for Elias. It was the closest he had ever come to saying, "Show me what I failed to see." Elias took the lead rope, not pulling, only holding, and stepped forward. Ghost hesitated, ears flicking toward the crowd, but when Elias breathed slowly, the horse matched him, breath for breath. And then Ghost stepped forward. The arena fell into a silence so deep it felt like snowfall. The walk was uneven. Ghost's injured leg shook beneath him, his gait slow and heavy. But each step landed with the quiet defiance of something choosing life. People leaned against the rails, their eyes wide, not for spectacle, but for reverence. A woman pressed her hand to her chest. A rancher removed his hat. Children who had been fidgeting earlier stood still, watching the white horse move through the light like a survivor returning from somewhere no one else had dared go. Grant walked along the rail, following the pair without speaking. There was something raw in the way he watched. Regret, disbelief, and a fear he kept buried beneath years of pride. When Ghost reached the center of the arena, Elias stopped. The horse stopped too, lowering his head until it pressed gently against Elias's shoulder. A soft gasp rippled through the stands. Elias closed his eyes, letting the moment settle around them like falling dust. He placed his palm over Ghost's heart, feeling the steady thump beneath scar tissue and swelling, a rhythm fighting to keep going, fighting to be heard. "You made it," Elias whispered. "That's enough." But Ghost wasn't finished. He shifted his weight, lifted his injured leg with visible effort, and took one more step. Just one. A single step drawn from every ounce of courage left inside him. The sound that followed wasn't applause, not at first. It was a kind of stunned hush, the kind that happens when people witness something vulnerable and unpolished and deeply true. Then slowly, like wind rising over the prairie, hands began to come together, not in celebration, but in honor. Tom wiped his eyes. "Well," he said thickly, "there's my miracle for the decade." Elias didn't hear him. His focus was on Ghost, on the way the horse's breath warmed his sleeve, on the trembling that came not from fear, but from exhaustion. "Let's get you home," he murmured. As they moved toward the gate, the crowd parted on instinct, leaving a narrow path. People reached out, not to touch Ghost, but to make space for him, to show respect without intrusion. Someone whispered, "He's still fighting." Another murmured, "That boy saved him." Grant stepped into their path as Elias and Ghost emerged from the arena. His face, usually unreadable, had softened around the edges in a way Elias had never seen. Grant's eyes traveled from Ghost to Elias and back again. "That wasn't just a walk," Grant said quietly. "That was something else." Elias nodded. "It was Ghost choosing to try again." Grant swallowed hard, his voice rough. "What you did out there, nobody else could have done it." Elias shook his head. "He did all the work. I just listened." Grant stared at the boy for a long moment. In that silence, something old and rigid inside the rancher seemed to loosen, just barely, but enough to show a crack where light might one day enter. "Take him home," Grant said. "He's earned his rest." Elias led Ghost away as the winter sun dipped into the horizon, casting long amber streaks across the ground. The town behind them buzzed with murmurs, but Elias didn't turn. His world, in that moment, was only Ghost, each slow step, each breath, each fragile thread of trust they'd built. By the time they reached the trailer, Ghost was tired but calm, his head lowering willingly toward Elias's chest. Tom closed the door behind them gently, as if sealing a vow. And in the fading light of the fading day, it was clear to everyone who'd watched. The boy hadn't just guided a horse. He had guided a town. Gently, firmly, toward compassion they didn't know they still possessed. The trailer door creaked open to the fading wash of evening light. Grant Whitlock stood there, hat in hand, as Elias guided Ghost down the ramp with the slow care of someone cradling a fragile truth. The ranch was quiet, eerily so. No voices, no clang of tools, no engines humming. Just the wind brushing across the frost-kissed fields, lifting the smell of cold soil and cedar from the barn walls. Ghost stepped onto the ground with a weary grunt, his breath drifting upward in pale threads. Elias placed a steady hand near the horse's jaw, guiding him toward the barn. Grant followed a few steps behind, his boots crunching through the thin crust of snow, as though each step cost more than the last. "Leave him in the north stall," Grant said, his voice quiet. "It's warmer there." Elias nodded. But when he laid the blanket across Ghost's back, the fabric brushed against the hidden marks on the horse's hind leg. Those faint punctures lined like a dotted confession. Elias froze. His hand lingered above the skin as the memory of Chapter 5's discovery spread through him again like a shadow. He could not keep the truth buried any longer. Tom Briggs stepped into the aisle, his face etched with exhaustion. He offered Elias a silent shake of the head. Don't say it. But the boy's eyes had already hardened with the weight of what needed to be spoken. Grant noticed the stillness. What's wrong with him? Elias didn't answer. He touched the injury again, gently but firmly, lifting the leg just enough for the marks to catch the lamplight. Grant frowned. What are those? Elias inhaled slowly. Their injection sights. The world tightened. Tom took one involuntary step forward. Elias, but the boy didn't stop. They're from performance enhancers, Elias said softly, regretfully. Not painkillers. Strong ones. The kind that numb the leg enough to make a horse run through injuries he shouldn't. Grant's breath hitched. It was barely audible, but it cracked through the quiet like brittle glass. He stared at the marks, then at Ghost, then back at Elias, each glance sharpening into disbelief, then anger, then something deeper, something hollow. No, Grant whispered. No one on my ranch would. They did, Elias said gently. Before the last race. Grant's hand tightened around the stall door until the wood creaked. Who told you that? Elias lowered his gaze. Your horse did. I only listened. The rancher's face flushed dark, not with fury alone, but with humiliation. Humiliation that he, of all people, the man who claimed to know every breath Ghost took, had missed the truth. Tom opened his mouth, but words died in his throat. Grant stepped back from the stall, shaking his head. I trusted them, every damn one of them. His breath grew heavy. I trusted that horse was ready, that he wanted that race. He wanted to live, Elias said quietly. He didn't know how to say no. Grant's eyes snapped toward Elias, but the sharpness dissolved almost instantly. The boy wasn't challenging him. He wasn't accusing. He was grieving. With Ghost, for Ghost, in a way Grant had never allowed himself to grieve for anything. Tom spoke, finally, his voice rough. Sir, I warned them. I told the trainers it wasn't right. Grant's stare cut through him, but Tom didn't look away. I told them you didn't need shortcuts, that Ghost didn't need them. Tom swallowed hard. But they didn't listen. The ranch felt colder. The lantern light flickered across Grant's features, deepening every line carved by years of pride, ambition, and buried fear. Grant walked into the stall, placing one trembling hand on Ghost's neck. The horse flinched at first, then settled as Elias whispered softly from behind. He trusted you, Elias murmured. He still does. Grant's shoulders collapsed, not dramatically, but with the quiet exhaustion of a man realizing the foundations he built his life on had been trembling long before today. I didn't protect him, Grant said, voice barely holding. I let others decide what was best for him. He stopped, breath catching, throat tightening. I should have known. Elias stepped beside him, his hand brushing Ghost's mane. Knowing isn't the same as listening. You're listening now. Grant looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Not as a kid, not as a stable hand, but as someone who had saved the only thing in the world Grant ever truly loved. You did what I couldn't, Grant said. You gave him a reason to try again. But Elias shook his head. He gave it to himself. I just didn't get in the way. Grant's eyes softened with something that felt like surrender. Teach me, he said quietly. Teach me whatever your grandmother taught you. Whatever made you like this. Elias blinked, taken by surprise. Sir, I'm not. Grant cut him off with a rough, tired breath. Kid, I've spent my whole life trying to control things. Horses, men, outcomes, but control didn't save Ghost. He looked down at the horse, who had turned his head toward Grant's voice with a weary trust. What saved him, Grant continued, was the one thing I forgot how to do. He swallowed hard, listening. Elias didn't speak. He let the moment settle, let the rancher feel the truth without rushing to fill the silence. Outside, the wind had stilled. The valley seemed to lean in, waiting. Grant stepped back from Ghost, then faced Elias fully. Help me make this right, he said. Not for the ranch, not for the reputation, for him. Elias nodded. I will. And in that dim, hay-scented barn, a man unmade himself, quietly, painfully, honestly, so something better could rise in the space he'd spent years holding shut. Ghost exhaled softly, lowering his head between them. Elias laid his hand against the horse's cheek, Grant doing the same from the other side. 3 shadows lingered in the lantern glow, each one bruised, flawed, uncertain, but bound now by a truth they could no longer deny. The thaw came quietly, not in a rush of warm wind or a sudden shift in the sky, but in the smallest places first. The edges of icicles dripping in hesitant rhythm, the thin crust of frost along the fence softening under a pale morning sun. Whitlock Valley was still cold, still carrying winter's stern breath, but something gentler moved through it now, like the land itself was remembering how to exhale. Elias arrived early, as he always did, boots brushing through slush instead of snow. Ghost lifted his head the moment Elias entered the barn, ears flicking forward, eyes calmer than Elias had ever seen them. The swelling in the horse's leg had eased, still stiff, but not sharp with pain. When Elias pressed his hand lightly against the tendon, Ghost didn't flinch. He only shifted his weight, trusting the boy's touch. Morning, Elias whispered. You're looking better today. Ghost pressed his muzzle gently into Elias's shoulder, a quiet greeting that carried the warmth of something earned, not demanded. Elias stroked the white mane, letting the moment stretch in simple gratitude. Behind him, slow footsteps echoed through the barn. Grant Whitlock approached with a thermos in one hand, steam rising from the top. Tom Briggs followed close behind, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, the stiff ache of old injuries hidden beneath layers of wool. Grant handed the thermos to Elias. Coffee, he said. You skipped dinner last night. Elias blinked at him. Thank you. Grant cleared his throat, looking anywhere but at the boy. Don't get used to it. But the corner of his mouth twitched, betraying the first flicker of humor Elias had ever seen from him. They spent the morning rewrapping Ghost's leg, applying herbs, checking muscle tension, and warming the horse's joints with slow, careful massages. Grant watched closely, not to supervise, but to learn. He mimicked Elias's motions, awkwardly at first, then with growing ease. Ghost accepted his touch without fear, which seemed to soften something deep in the rancher's chest each time it happened. You know, Tom said at one point, leaning against a stall post. "If someone told me a month ago I'd see Whitlock taking lessons from a kid, I'd have bet my paycheck against it." Grant shot him a look. "It's not lessons. It's collaboration." Elias hid a small smile. Tom did not. Later, when the sun climbed higher, Elias led Ghost out to the small paddock behind the barn. The ground was still damp, but patches of grass peeked through where the snow had melted away. Ghost walked slowly beside Elias, steps unsteady but determined. Grant watched from the fence line, elbows resting on the rail, the weight of years pressing into his stance. Ghost paused halfway across the paddock, sniffing the cold air. Elias waited. The horse lifted his head, exhaled, and took a single quiet step forward. Then another. Grant swallowed hard. "He hasn't walked like that since before the race." "It'll take time," Elias said. "But he's healing." Grant nodded, wiping moisture from his eye disguised as a scratch above the brow. "Funny thing," he murmured, "how the hardest part of healing is admitting something was broken in the first place." Elias didn't push the moment. He simply stood beside Ghost, letting the silence brim with meaning. The wind carried the soft rustle of distant pines and the faint laughter of ranch hands starting their day. Grant leaned against the fence. "I want to do this right," he said finally. "No more shortcuts. No pushing him for trophies or reputation. I want Ghost to just live." Elias looked at him, eyes gentle. "Then listen to him first. He'll tell you what he needs." Ghost nudged Grant's arm as if proving the point. Grant let out a breath that fogged the air, a small sound, almost a laugh. "Well, that's clear enough." For the first time, all three of them, man, boy, and horse, stood together without the shadow of expectations. No crowds, no deadlines, just the thin sunlight of a winter morning breaking open across the valley, warming what had been cold for too long. They stayed outside until Ghost began to tire, then walked him back to the barn. Elias brushed him down with soft strokes, humming quietly the tune his grandmother once hummed to the animals she tended. Ghost lowered his head, eyes half-lidded in comfort. Grant watched from the doorway. "Elias," he said, voice softer than the straw beneath their boots. "I meant what I said. This ranch, it's better with you in it." Elias didn't answer right away. He finished brushing Ghost's mane before turning to the rancher. "I'm not here for the ranch," he said. "I'm here for him, and for whatever he needs next." Grant nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do, together." Outside, the sun brightened just enough to turn the melting snow into glistening beads across the ground. The valley felt different, wider, quieter, waiting for spring. Tom stepped into the aisle and leaned on the rail beside them, his voice warm with a quiet pride. "Feels like the day the snow finally gave up," he said. Elias smiled. Ghost shifted his weight, lowering his head until it rested near Elias's chest. And in that stillness, under the thawing sky, it was clear something had changed. Something small, humble, and beautifully human. Not a victory. Not a miracle. Just the gentle, steady work of healing. For Ghost. For Elias. For Grant. For whatever came next. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me which moment stayed with you the longest, or simply share what Ghost and Elias made you feel. Your comments help keep stories like this alive. And if you'd like to join me for the next journey, consider subscribing. There are many more gentle, human stories waiting for you.